Today we continue our journey through the book of Acts, but we are on Paul's second missionary journey. He's already taken his first trip up into what we would call Turkey today. And now he's on his second trip. He started in Jerusalem, traveled all the way up through Lebanon, Syria, into Turkey. He's now come over into Macedonia, which is sort of north of Greece, and traveling down into the southern portion of Greece. And last week in chapter 17, he was in Athens, and this week he has traveled to Corinth. And that is where we're going to pick up the story. But before we do that, I just want to think for a moment about the word refugee. This is a very politicized word, I think, in our culture and climate. In the US, we have this ongoing migration of people from Central and South America. And there's this question: should they be considered refugees? How do we define a refugee? Who qualifies as a refugee? Right now we have refugees from the conflict in Afghanistan, and they're coming, some here to Rochester. I know there's others in Buffalo. And so as they're resettling into the United States, then they're going to make new lives for themselves. What sort of reception are they going to receive, particularly when their religion, in the case of those from Afghanistan, their religion is going to be different than the majority religion here of Christianity. So the Bible actually doesn't use the word refugee very often. If you have a King James Version and you do a search, you won't find it there at all. If you have a New International Version and you look it up and do a search, you'll find, I believe, 2 occurrences of the word refugee. And the one that I could find with the most was 13. And that was a more contemporary version called The Voice. It's one that I like. And it uses the word refugee 13 times. That's still not very much. I want you to consider for a moment that even though this word is not used, consider how many people in the Bible could be described as refugees. Right from the very beginning, Adam and Eve, when they were evicted from the garden, in a sense, are refugees, forcibly made to move from their home to go and find another home in another place. We could look at someone like, well, I guess in a sense, Noah, right? Fits that criteria. What about Abraham? Jacob takes his family down to Egypt during a time of famine. Is he an economic refugee? Joseph was already down there in Egypt, again, sold into slavery. Perhaps refugee is an appropriate description of him. We can perhaps look at other people. David, when he went to live amongst the Philistines when he was running away from Saul, perhaps qualifies as a refugee. Certainly the many Israelites, many Jews taken into captivity in Babylon and in Assyria, and those that lived there, they would have lived as refugees in that country with no viable way back to their own homeland. And then, of course, Jesus himself is a political refugee. As an infant, he's forced to flee from Herod down into Egypt and doesn't return until Herod's death. And so now when we come to the book of Acts and we're looking at Paul and his travels, we need to be very aware that the Jews that have scattered throughout the Roman Empire, some of them made the choice. We would think of them more as migrants than refugees. But some of them don't have a choice, and they've been forced to flee, or they were perhaps on the losing side of a war. I mean, there's all sorts of circumstances. And so these Jews scattered around the Mediterranean, many of them would qualify as being described as refugees. And we're going to see in just a moment another group of Jews that had been living in Rome, that when there was a disturbance in Rome amongst the Jewish population, the Jewish community in Rome, the emperor just said, enough, I've had enough of all of you, all the Jews need to get out of Rome. And so they had to leave again, give up their business, just take what they could carry and go to wherever it was that they could. And so they were again refugees from Rome to wherever they could find safety. So the first verse of Acts, this is where we pick up Acts chapter 18. We find that Paul has arrived in Corinth. I'm going to put up some pictures on the screen here to give you an idea of what the map looks like. And I know not everybody's fascinated by maps, but I really want us to try and understand a little bit about Corinth, about the geography, and also about the people that are there, because I think it's very important to us as we seek to understand the events that took place in Corinth. And so you can see he's traveled from Athens, which is a little north and a little to the east of Corinth. And as he comes across the isthmus, a narrow neck of land, to the bigger area, Peloponnesia, and you can see some other familiar names on this map. You can see Olympia over there on the left, and maybe some others that you recognize there in ancient Greece. And so the distance that he travels from Athens to Corinth is about 50 miles if he traveled by land. And I want to give you, just read from another resource that I found, a bit of background on the city of Corinth. Corinth was different to a lot of cities. It had been a major city in that part of the world as early as 700 years before Christ, maybe even a little earlier. But it was destroyed by the Romans, like wiped out due to a rebellion. So it was wiped out in 144 BC. So 144 years before Christ, the city of Corinth was, obliterated. And then it was left empty for 100 years. So not a lot of traffic, just a few squatters living there. In 44 BC, so not all that long before Jesus, Julius Caesar rebuilt the city, and he does this as a Roman colony. I've talked in other weeks about these Roman colonies. They were places for the aristocracy of Rome to resettle soldiers and other people that had certainly served the empire, but they weren't safe, I suppose, to be in Rome, or Rome didn't have the capacity to house them all. So they created these colony cities in different parts of their empire, and we saw some of those over in Turkey before. And so this is Corinth is another Roman colony, a new city. And so other than the squatters living in the ruins, as well as the priests for the temple of Apollo, which was a significant temple that survived the destruction, Corinth was repopulated. Okay, and listen who it was repopulated with: slaves, Roman military veterans, and many foreigners. Corinth came to be known the new city for its artwork, its craftsmanship, and the Isthmian Games. It says these games were second only to the Olympics, not very far from Olympia itself. Even more, this city had a reputation for struggle and competition. This was prevalent among the athletic games as well as the economic classes. Slaves were constantly struggling to buy their freedom, find power, and gain honor. Paul's letters to the Corinthians indicate that those in the church also struggled with each other for power, honor, and status. When Paul arrived at the colony in about the year 50 AD, we can be pretty precise with that based on the mention of the Roman governor. He arrives there and the colony is less than 100 years old. Okay, even though it could trace its distant ancient origins to 700 AD, 700 BC, now in the 50 AD, it's less than 100 years old. And so while the governing class, the sort of Roman citizen elite, took great pride in being more Roman than Rome, so they really wanted to impress Rome, they wanted to do things right because they didn't want to be destroyed again. It was very clear to them that their ongoing prosperity and security were tied to being how well they performed as a Roman city. Part of that would have very much included their dedication to worshipping Caesar and the emperor, whoever that happened to be at the time. And so while the upper classes have those concerns for social security and being Roman, maintaining Roman culture, the lower classes were poor, they were diverse, and with many first and second generation immigrants, slaves and refugees living in that city. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 to 3, Paul there describes his feelings as he was approaching Corinth. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, it says, "And so it was with me, brothers and sisters. When I came to you, I did not come with eloquence or human wisdom, as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you, except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. I came to you in weakness, with great fear and trembling." So Paul has left Corinth, where he's been there with the philosophers, he's defended his faith, he's cited Roman poets, and sort of had this highfalutin conversation with them. But now when he comes to Corinth, he's leaving his comfort zone. He says, I determined I wasn't going to know any of that. I knew a bit where I was going. I'm coming with great fear and trembling. And I'm going to keep the message simple. I'm going to focus on God. Focus on Jesus and Him crucified. So that's a bit surprising, I think, really, when we think of Paul and his personality. But we need to realize that it's intimidating to him to leave his comfort zone. And so Paul, what would make Paul feel that way is it's remembering that it's a blue-collar city. It's a young city. It's kind of like a bit like the Wild West still. It's home to the temples of Apollos, but also of Aphrodite. And there's sort of different stories about Aphrodite and the temple and the fertility and the rituals, the immoral rituals that accompanied that temple worship. And it was also, and you can see, I'll put this picture up, you can see here the ruins of the temple to Apollos, which would have been obviously quite a bit bigger than it looks there. But also up on top of that mountain, the Acropolis, was the temple of Aphrodite. And so it was very significant. It was seen for miles and miles. You would be able to see it if you were on the right angle. And certainly had a lot of influence over the city at the bottom of that mountain. As a port city, it also would have brought in a rough population of merchants, sailors, and mercenaries. So this was a bustling, busy place, but it was, as I said, very, very blue collar is perhaps the best way. It was the Pittsburgh. Can I say that? It was the Pittsburgh. It was a working class city of ancient Greece. So Paul arrives in this city and quickly meets and bonds with these Italian Jewish refugees, Aquila and Priscilla. They are tent makers. Paul is a tent maker. So not only are they Jews, they're apparently believers in Jesus or quickly become believers in Jesus, and they also work the same trade as Paul. And so he spends his days during the week working in the shop with them, and then he goes to the Sabbath and he teaches the synagogue, debates in the synagogue on the Sabbath. And then when Silas and Timothy catch up to him, when he was in Athens, he had sent them back to Thessalonica, a place he'd been to earlier. And so they've been to Thessalonica, stayed there, done some teaching, then they come back to find Paul. Perhaps they go to Athens, he's not there. Oh, he's gone on to Corinth. And so they come to Corinth and they catch up, they find him. And it says Paul is greatly encouraged, and he stops the tent making and he starts teaching full time. And he reaches a point of frustration with the Jews. There's opposition, they're not hearing what he's teaching, and he's like, I've had enough. In fact, his language here is really pretty bold, no real surprise. It says in verse 6 of chapter 18, they opposed Paul, they became abusive, he shook out his clothes in protest and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent of it. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." I think it's worth pointing out that Paul's frustration does not mirror God's frustration. God didn't ever give up on the Jews. Okay, God didn't wipe the dust from his feet. And so he still loves, cares for, and extends himself towards these people, even as Paul walks away from them. However, it's interesting that although we have this moment of frustration from Paul, he really doesn't walk very far. In fact, he just walks next door to the synagogue. And there was apparently a Greek believer, and so Paul sort of stays with him, sets up shop there, and you can imagine that this wasn't a very popular move from those in the synagogue. Here are all these Jews from around the city. They come to the synagogue every Sabbath, and there's Paul right next door, and he is still teaching that stuff, and he's bringing in the Gentiles. He's living with the Gentile. Remember, the Gentiles are unclean in the eyes of the Jews, although not the Christians. And so it must have just grated at them. And then on top of that, we see that one of the leaders of the synagogue, Crispus, and all his household believe and are baptized. And so now every Sabbath they come, or whether it be the Sabbath or the Sunday, but they come, and they're coming not to the synagogue, although they're walking down the same street, they're going to the house next door, seeing the people that they've seen perhaps their whole lives. And so you can imagine that the Jewish community must have been in chaos at the presence of Paul, his message, and just the way things have been turned upside down there in Corinth. So Paul is like confronted with this opposition, this distrust, this enmity. But God sends him a vision and reassures him. He says, "Look, I've got a lot of people in this city. You're going to be okay." And that was important for Paul, because I think when he got to Corinth, he was discouraged. He was only going there to the synagogue once a week. He was working in the shop. He was worn out. He was on his own. He'd been kicked out of other cities. He'd only been able to stay there 2 or 3 weeks at a time. And it seems that he was just exhausted when he arrives. And so this message from God says, "No, look, don't worry, it's going to be okay. I'm going to take care of you." And so he ends up staying here in Corinth for 18 months. Must have seemed like forever. for Paul after all the moves that he'd made, how quickly he'd been traveling. But after a while, the Jewish community there sees an opportunity to get rid of him. There's a new proconsul, or sort of acting as a governor, that has been appointed there in that region. And so they come to him to complain about Paul. And what happens next is really, I think, quite shocking. The Roman governor basically tells them that this issue isn't important enough for Rome to get involved in. We're not going to have anything, we don't want to have anything to do with it. You just need to sort this out. So picture this, though, in different terms. You can say, oh, no big deal. But this Jewish community is an ethnic and a religious minority. And they've come to the courts and in the city where they're citizens. They own businesses, they're trying to conduct business, they want to be treated as equals, and they're seeking to resolve a dispute. And when they get to the courts, they're told that their dispute is irrelevant to the interests of the ruling classes, to the interests of the ruling majority. It doesn't matter how important it is to you, because it's not of interest to the rulers, they're not going to get involved. And so how big do you think the Jews felt at that point? Here they are wanting to be accepted as contributors, as part of society, and yet they're told, no, that dispute, it's big to you, but it doesn't matter to us. Just go away, leave us alone. And so they must have felt like this. And then on top of that, the leader of the synagogue, he is beaten, and we're not really told by who or why. Possibly it was simply, if that's the right word, possibly it was an anti-Semitic attack, just as a way of saying, why are you bothering us? But again, it just really demonstrates how much of a minority the Jews are. You see, we can read this text, read these stories and think, oh, these are important people in important places, really influencing society, really making a difference. But in fact, they're just average people. They're minority people. They're on the fringe of society. They're not accepted into the courts and the palaces and the places of business, places of influence in that city. And in fact, they don't even care about them. Just go away. Leave us alone to run the place. And so as this man is beaten right there in front of the court, the governor simply ignores it, and no justice is going to be given for that either, as long as he's not killed, I suppose. And so while that injustice is shocking to the Jewish community, and perhaps to us as we read it, although I suspect there are some of you watching that identify with that description. For Paul and the Christians, it's really a relief. You see, the court says, oh, those Christians, well, they're part of the Jews. That's a Jewish problem. And those Gentiles that are becoming Christians, that's a Jewish problem. That's your thing to sort out. So what it means is that the Romans, at least here in Greece, aren't regarding Christianity as a separate thing. Because if it was separate, then perhaps the people who follow Christianity would need to go and worship Caesar and worship the other idols, because it was only the Jews that had been given an exemption. But because this Roman governor groups them all together, then even the Gentiles that are converting to Christianity are regarded as Jews, and so exempt from that participating in the pagan rituals. So it says that Paul was not given a chance to speak. He was just about to speak when the governor says, nope, I'm not having anything to do with it. But he must have been smiling on the inside as he thought through the consequences of that. That certainly made it easier for the Gentiles to become Christians there in Corinth. So from Corinth, Paul is going to leave sometime after this. He hangs around for a little while, but then eventually he leaves. He travels with Priscilla and Aquila. They were refugees from Italy to Corinth, and now they're on the move again to over to Ephesus. And they travel together to Ephesus. Paul leaves them there, and he heads down to Jerusalem to check in on the church there and to fulfill a vow that he has made. And so as Paul writes back to the church in Corinth, he gets to Ephesus, but he wants to send them more instructions, or perhaps he's received, it seems most likely that he's received a letter from Corinth, the church there, and they've got a list of questions and situations, and so Paul writes back to them. He says, brothers, this is in chapter 1 and verse 26, brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards, not many were influential, not many were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. The church in Corinth consisted of people who'd been, many of whom had been ungodly people. The Gentiles were a rough crowd. They weren't the upper class. They weren't sophisticated. These were the refugees. These were the slaves. These were the Riff, Raff, the mercenaries, the travelers, those that just came from the countryside trying to make a living. And now in 1 Corinthians, we're going to see that there's some who are wealthier. I mean, because the Lord's Supper is going to get divided between those who are wealthy with their own food and homes and those that are poor and don't have fancy food. So there's some of that, but by and large, it seems that most of them were not people of influence in the community. And so in this short account of Paul's time in Corinth, I want to make just a couple of observations to leave with you. The first one is, I think, one that we see time and again with Paul, and that is that we need each other. We need each other. Christianity is not, cannot, should not be a solitary endeavor. Okay? We need each other. Paul, when he arrives, he immediately gravitates towards Aquila and Priscilla. He stays in the home of a Gentile Christian. He has these people around him. And then when Timothy and Silas come, look how encouraged he is. He totally changes his ministry. He's encouraged by the news they bring of the churches they've left behind, but also just by their presence, that he's no longer doing this alone. And so perhaps you don't feel like you need encouragement in that way. You need relationships, but I can promise you that there are other people in your church who need you in their lives, that you have experience, that you can speak into them, into their lives, that will encourage and guide them and help them. The second thing is that the church shouldn't look like us. I think Paul is to be respected to go into a city that he knew didn't fit him very well. He could have stayed in Athens longer, but he said, you know, the people over there need Jesus. People over there need Jesus, and so I'm going to go over there. And he says he goes with great fear and trembling, but he still went. And he adapts his message to know nothing but Christ and Him crucified. He's going to keep this simple, and he stays there for 18 months. He kind of gives up this itinerant preacher that he's been, and he sews tents, he makes tents, and he works at that for a while because that's what it was going to take. He was going to gain credibility with these people, these refugees, these people that had immigrated there recently, didn't have generational wealth passed on to them, weren't Roman, well, maybe they were Roman citizens, some of them, but not wealthy Roman citizens, military veterans. And so he comes in and he says, I'll join you, I'll get my hands dirty, I'll work with you, and we'll talk about Jesus as we do that. And he overcame his fears. He committed to serving the people of Corinth, whoever they were. And so we need to be careful that the church, we don't make a church that looks like us. And it's hard not to do that because we are the church. But we need to be committed to radical hospitality, that anyone, no matter who they are, how different they are, is welcome among us. And that we don't subconsciously filter who we share the gospel with. That we don't decide ahead of time who will accept the gospel and who will not, who will respond to Jesus and who will not. Sometimes we filter out the educated and the wealthy. Sometimes we filter out the uneducated and the poor. And sometimes maybe it's the people in the middle. But Paul is very careful not to do that, whether they be Jew or Gentile, whether they be educated or immigrant. He says, no, the gospel is here and I want to tell you about it. And then the third thing is that God calls us to a higher set of values. You see, it would be, what we see in this church is that people, when they come to Christ, they bring their baggage with us, don't we? You brought your baggage, I brought my baggage. And oftentimes that's our prejudices and our bad habits and things that we struggle with, our self-centeredness. And so we see in Corinth this competitive place of with a lot of conflict and people trying to get ahead in life and doing whatever it takes to get ahead. And so right at the beginning of the Corinthian letter, there's this dispute about, I follow Paul, I follow Apollos, I follow... Who do people go to? And Paul says, no, you need to follow Jesus. Don't be competitive about that. Later on, as I mentioned, with the Lord's Supper in 1 Corinthians 11, there's some that are wealthy or wealthier that are eating by themselves and some that are poor that are barely eating. And he says, that's not the picture of the church. And so there's some that are taking others to court, perhaps that same court that Paul himself stood before. And they're taking others to court outside, going to these Roman judges looking for justice against another Christian. And Paul says, no, don't do that. And so we see all these divisions and competitions that are taking place. And Paul's saying, no, the church isn't like that. Instead, in 2 Corinthians 5 and starting in verse 16, I want to read this for you. It says, so from now on, we regard no one from a worldly point of view. Though we once regarded Christ in this way, we do so no longer. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come, the old has gone, the new is here. All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ, not counting people's sins against them. And he has committed to us the message of reconciliation. We are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. We implore you, on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. So for this church in Corinth to be reconciled to God, they first had to be reconciled to each other. They had to see that they were all only reconciled to God through Christ. None of them by their own virtues. And so this ministry, of reconciliation, removes that sense of competition that seems to be evident in the church there, as these desperate people are seeking to establish their lives and move forward in what was a difficult context. So I think here's our question for us. So three things. We need each other. The church shouldn't look like us, and that God calls all of us to a high set of values. Yes, we bring our baggage, but God says, no, this is, if that's who you were, but this is who I want you to be. And we're always pushing forward into that. And so in Corinth, God called Paul out of his comfort zone. I think the question for us to answer as we get to the end of this passage is to ask ourselves, are we willing to leave our comfort zone in order to demonstrate our love for God by loving our neighbor? Are we willing to leave our comfort zone in order to demonstrate our love for God by loving our neighbor.
Ba-dum-bum.